Hi, I'm Julie Miller and I work for the community organization CASE in the Mauricie and the Centre-Quebec. And today we're in the Grey Nuns cemetery in Nicolet to visit the grave of Annie Hyland. And Annie was from an English-speaking background. There were once upon a time quite a lot of people from Irish families who lived in the area all the way from Nicolet, along the Nicolet River to Bécancour, Sainte-Brigitte-des-Saults and Drummondville. And Annie herself was born in Sainte-Brigitte-des-Saults. She lived from 1873 until 1939. And I'd like to tell you her story, and it's not an easy story. But first of all, I'll say that the welcome we've had here has been so touching. We were met by two Grey Nuns this morning who had decorated Annie's grave with flowers and had a long chat with us about their lives. And the Grey Nuns are mostly a nursing order, a missionary order as well, but mostly associated with hospitals and playing different roles to support a hospital. Although there were teachers as well. So about Annie Hyland. Annie first caught my attention when I saw a short passage in a local history book in reference to her. And there was a phrase that jumped out at me, and it was, Annie defended the rights of the Indians. I thought, well, what was that about? She lived 1873 to 1939. What was that about? And then suddenly I realized that Annie had spent 35 years of her life associated in one way or another with residential schools on the Blood Reserve in Cardston, Alberta. So I wondered, what was Annie's role there? What brought her out there? And before we go out to Alberta, we're going to go back to Sainte-Brigitte, where Annie was born, the fifth of 8 children, to Farmer Danny. Maybe they called him Danny, but his name was Daniel Hyland, and his wife Mary White. And Annie was the eldest daughter. And she was a bit different from her sisters and brothers. She had a different childhood anyway, because Daniel's brother, Annie's uncle William, was a businessman in Drummondville, and he and his wife were childless, and they wanted to adopt Annie. They just loved her. So her father wouldn't hear of it. He wouldn't give his daughter away, but he did allow her to divide her time between the farm in Sainte-Brigitte and her uncle's house in Drummondville, which she did. Now, Uncle William was very, very generous, and he always made sure that Annie, from a young child through her adolescence, had her own pocket money. And it seems that she spent it unfailingly on charity. She did everything she could to ease the suffering of the poor, to help them out. And when she was in Drummondville, she and her aunt attended Mass every single day. So with such a level of religious devotion, you'd think that Annie had decided from a very young age that she was going to become a nun. She dreamed of becoming a nun. That's the natural conclusion. But it wasn't like that at all. Annie did not dream of becoming a nun. She loved her freedom and her autonomy too much. She didn't want to marry, but she didn't want to become a nun either. She was vivacious, she had lots of friends, she was very musical, but she was also extremely tender-hearted, compassionate, determined, and she had inherited a fierce work ethic from both her parents on the farm. So she attended the Convent School in Drummondville for 6 years, thanks to Uncle William, who paid the tuition, no doubt. But after that, Annie went to Nicolet, where she was apprenticed as a dressmaker. Now, when she was in Nicolet, she would go to and from the workshop, and she would pass the Hôtel Dieu hospital run by the Grey Nuns, and she would stop there and pray every day in the chapel. She'd also visit the wards. And she was extremely touched by all the love and care the Grey Nuns gave to the elderly and to the very sick and feeble. But even then, she did not think about becoming a nun. No, she was going to be independent, she was going to earn some money, and she was going to live with her aunt and uncle and take care of them in their old age and repay the kindnesses that they'd given her. Well, the Bishop of Nicolet, Elphège Gravel, had other ideas, and he set himself the task of converting Annie to the idea of becoming a nun. So she was, of course, Catholic. He didn't have to convert her, but he was going to convince her that she had the vocation. And he had to work really hard for months because she didn't think she had the vocation. She had so many doubts, and he kept reassuring her. And he was tenacious because he knew that the church needed women for their work. They needed teachers, nurses, missionaries, domestics. And he didn't give up. And he won. He convinced her. Annie's decision to enter the novitiate did not cause unanimous joy among her family members, despite the fact that they were a really religious family. Her mother was delighted, but her father was dead set against it. In Annie's own recollections, Daniel said to her, "I will never say yes to this. I cannot see you shut up inside those walls for your entire life. But you must make your own decisions, and you've made your own decision, and I won't be an obstacle to your happiness." So on that day in May of 1893, Annie knelt before her father, and he gave her a traditional, formal, very ancient and significant paternal blessing. He put his hand on her head, and he asked God to bless her. And I think this was a gift that Daniel gave her, and not so much because of the blessing, although that was important as well. But it was the fact that he gave it despite his opposition to what she wanted to do. He was respecting her right to choose her own life path. He was respecting her own autonomy. And not all fathers in 1893 were doing this with their daughters or with women in general, you have to remember. So it's somewhat ironic then that in May of 1893, when Annie left for the convent, she had received the gift of autonomy from her father, pretty much for her whole life, and she was now entering an institution where obedience was the number one virtue, and autonomy was really not part of the package. Henceforth, she would have to obey her superiors. By 1901, Annie Hyland, now Sister St. Patrick, found herself on the Immaculate Conception School on the Blood Reserve in Cardston, Alberta. And the school was quite small at first. There were only 28 students, but enrollment began to grow, especially in the 20s, when they built a new school called St. Mary's. And Annie was there for 35 years, all told. The first 17 years, roughly, she was a teacher and the musical director. And for the last 17 years, from about 1920 to 37, she was their nurse. And this is where the dark chapter of Annie Hyland's life starts, her adulthood, much darker than her childhood. And it's dark for two reasons, and in two senses. First of all, because we don't have any of her journals or her letters, so we don't know what her own thoughts, her own experiences, her own feelings were. And secondly, because, of course, Annie spent 35 years as part of the residential school system, which is one of the greatest stains on our country's history. So what did Annie do there? What was her role there? What happened to the young, tender-hearted, vivacious girl who went out there? Did she have misgivings? Did she have doubts? Did she understand the consequences of what was going on in those schools? I'd like to go back to that chapter, or that reference in the old history book I found. Annie defended the rights of the Indians. I'd like to hope that her love of autonomy led to her respecting the autonomy of others, but I just don't know. And a word now about obedience and disobedience back in the day. So for the sisters at that time, obedience was everything. There was a price to pay. You were disciplined if you did not obey your orders. And if you were given a new job, a new task, a new responsibility, it wasn't called that. It was called, literally, an obedience. So Annie would receive a letter telling her about her new obedience, which would be a new job or responsibility, whatever. And from the 1920s on, in these letters, there was always be a phrase or two of sympathy for her ill health. But nevertheless, they'd say, you have to obey these orders. Even if you deserve a rest, I'm sorry, you can't have one, you must continue. So there was no way out. And if you look at the wider society back at that time, whistleblowers were not well perceived. I mean, they might still not be well seen today, and they face a really hard life. A case in point is Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, who worked for public health, and he wrote a report on the conditions in residential schools back in 1907. And he demanded reforms so that there would be no unnecessary deaths of children. Well, his superiors didn't like that at all. Within years, his funding was completely cut. He was never able to advance in the public service, and he was eventually forced into retirement. So that's what happened to people who did not obey back in the day. It was very, very difficult. So what do we know about Annie? And what do we know about the school and the years that she spent there? Well, we do know that she was very well liked. And it seems that her memory is well liked as well, because as I said, when we came here, the nuns came out and had beautiful flowers on her grave. Apparently she preferred to live her faith rather than lecture about it. And there's another thing that was very interesting. She was very fond of giving gifts and tokens of her affection to not only her colleagues but her students. And there's an interesting thing in the annals of the Grey Nuns. There's a mention of a student of Annie's who came out to Nicolet after her death. His name was Christopher Shade. And the nuns only say two things about him in the reference. One, he'd converted to Protestantism. And two, he was wearing actually quite a pretty tie pin that had been given to him by Sister St. Patrick. And what we know about the schools themselves is thanks to the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation at the University of Manitoba. They've gathered information on a lot of the residential schools, and particularly about St. Mary's, so from the 20s on, from the time that Annie was the nurse. So there were reports of severe corporal punishment, specifically of the boys being shut in rooms for days as punishment. In the 1920s, there were reports that teaching was so bad that the federal government finally paid for a teacher's training course for the Grey Nuns in 1924. And in 1926, there was a farm associated with the school, also with the Anglican school on the same reserve, and the boys were said to work like slaves without proper supervision. All in all, in the 35 years that Annie was on the blood reserve in Cardston, there were 25 children who died. And remember, this was when Annie was the nurse. So would she have tended their wounds? And would she have heard them coughing? Because she would have been coughing herself. She had TB and she died of it. And would she have washed and shrouded the bodies of the dead children? Annie's story just brings up so many questions, so many difficult questions. What if she hadn't become a nun? And what was it that made her change her mind about her original life plan? Another question that comes to mind and bothers me is, how can someone who is so obviously tender-hearted and compassionate have been part of the residential school system, which was such a stain on our country's history? She was a nurse. Was she able to help the children? Was she able to alleviate suffering? Or was she helpless? Or worse, did she ever contribute to any deaths? Another question, what power did the nuns have to make complaints? What power did they have within the system to make change? They're all big questions, and I do think it's important to grapple with them as we deal with the legacy of the residential schools so that we can all go forward as a stronger community. And you know that old saying, those who don't know their history are bound to repeat it. So it's really important to grapple with these questions. And I'm grateful to the memory of Annie Hyland for opening the door to so many questions. I'd also like to thank the Grey Nuns once again for their incredibly welcoming, warm, friendly reception here in the cemetery. I'd like to thank their archivist, Alcé Pené, who helped me find a lot of information about Annie Hyland. And I'd also like to thank the archivists at the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation.